Okay, we're now going to take our knowledge of proportions and we're going to apply that to percents. The thing to think about this is kind of essentially 3 different types of problems. I'm going to cram it into one, and then I'm going to give you a second method to use to solve them. And whichever method you prefer, it's totally fine. Either one will work, but you need to be familiar with both of them because some questions on the EOG could ask things like, which method or which way could you solve this? And it'll give you 3 different or 4 different ways to solve it, and you have to figure out which one's correct. And in those cases, so they're not necessarily assessing, do you know how to solve the problem, but they're seeing, do you know how to figure it out? So we're going to take a look at the first thing, or the first one, which says find 60% of 125. And the thing to think about is we have to identify what the part in the problem is, what the whole in the problem is, the whole amount, and what the percent is going to be. And you'll notice that I gave you this thing of part over whole equals percent over 100. That's a pretty standard way to think of it. The other way you can think of it as is over of equals percent over 100 is being the part of equaling the whole amount. Is over of equals percent over 100 is something I was taught when I went through 7th grade. And so if they did it that way, you know, however many years ago it may be, because I'm not saying, and it's still around now, it's probably a good method to help us solve the problem and think of it as a way to remember what is the part and what is the whole. If you don't like proportions, there is an equation way to do it, which is on the right, the part equals whole times the percent as a decimal. That is a second way to solve this problem. For these 3, I'm going to show you both, and I think it'd be good for you to write in your books, which have both of them there so you can reference back to it. But after this, feel free to pick the one you like the best. You don't necessarily have to stick with one or the other. Or one or the other isn't any better or worse. It's all about your comfort level. I think that for a lot of students, the proportion is a little bit easier because it's the one way that you know is going to work every time. But if your understanding of part and whole is pretty solid, then the equation can be a way that works really, really well for you. So either way, it doesn't matter. You choose. So the first problem, find 60% of 125. If we are doing the proportion way, we have to think that we're dealing with part over whole equals percent over 100. And so the first thing that I know I'm going to do is I'm going to set it up like this, where I have this unknown ratio on the left and then an equal sign, and then I'm going to have an unknown numerator, and it's over 100. Always, always, always the percent, no matter what the number is, the percent's going to go over 100. Doesn't matter if it's 1,000,000%, it would be 1,000,000 over 100. Whatever has a percent sign, over 100. So then we have to identify the part and the whole. 125 in this case is going to be our whole amount. It says 60% of the 125. We want to know if that is how much of that 125 is makes up 60% of that number. So then we can go cross multiply 100 times x, and 125 times 60, which gives us 100x equals 7,500. We can then come in and divide by 100, and we get that x is equal to 75. And we don't need to worry about units because we weren't given any initially. Now, if we do not like solving it the proportion way, we can think of it as the part. So in this case, I'm going to use p this time because I think that the times and the x look too similar. The part is going to equal the whole amount, so in this case 125, times our percent as a decimal. Remember that to make the percent as a decimal, it means you're dividing by 100, which is essentially moving the decimal points 2 spaces to the left. So that's how we end up with times 0.60. And if you take 125 times 0.60, you're going to get 75. Either way you go about it, both of them are correct. Doesn't matter. Pick the way you like the best and the one that makes the most sense with understanding. Don't just pick the equation way because it's going to be in your mind quicker or there was less work. Go with the one that makes most sense. Because if you're struggling to remember it and you're struggling to figure out what goes where, it's not any quicker. It's going to end up being longer. So go with the way that makes the most sense and the way that you feel the most comfortable with. Looking at the second one, we have 14 is 35% of what number? So we know, if I'm doing proportions, to start our setup this way. And the first thing, the easy part to fill in is the percent. In this case, we know it's 35. Why? Has a percent sign after it, of course. So 35 over 100. Pretty straightforward. Now to determine that 14. It says 14 is 35% of what number? 14 is going to be our part. You can think of it as a couple of ways. It says 14 is 35%. That means 14 and 35% represent equivalent values. If 35 is on top, then 14 has to go on top. You can also say that 14 is, since that represents our is, that's our part, that's our numerator. Anything to that effect of what number? We don't know what the whole number is. So we can put our variable, and in this case I'm going to use W for whole number. We can go through and cross multiply. W times 35 equals 14 times 100. 35W equals 1400. Divide both sides by 35. And you get that W is equal to 40. Now let's say we wanted to go about it using the equation. The part number is 14 is equal to the whole amount times 35%. To make it a decimal, we divide by 100. And we get 0.35. So to figure out W, we have to say 14 divided by 0.35. Because we do the inverse operation of multiplication, and then we find out the whole amount is in fact 40. Doesn't matter which way you go about it. Again, both are correct and you arrive at the answer either way. Your choice about the method. Going into the last one, what percent is 12 of 80? So we start this way, once again, two ratios and 100 goes in the denominator of the second one. Technically it doesn't really matter where the 100 goes, but it's kind of the standard. We all just learned it in this manner, so we put it there. If you want to put it on the bottom of the first ratio, that's fine. It's not a huge deal. When you read this, you should note there's no percent sign. So we are in fact looking for the percent. So I'm going to use P to represent percent. Now to determine the part and the whole. What percent is 12 of 80? Is 12 of 80. So is 12 is the part, of 80 is the whole. Is their relationship. We can now cross multiply. 80 times P equals 12 times 100. 80P equals 1200. We then come in and divide both sides by 80 to get that P is equal to 15. If we would rather do it as an equation, the part is 12 equals the whole amount of 80 times our percent. We come in and we divide 12 by 80. So I've shown you how to write divide two different ways between the last one and this one. Whichever way makes you happy, feel free to go with that. We then get 0.15 is what P is. Now, that's the decimal form. We have to go and change this into the percent form. Okay, whoops, and I forgot my symbol. There, my unit's there. So 15% is our answer either way you look at it. We can now take this idea of setting up these proportions or these equations to find the whole, to find the part, or to find the percent, and we can now apply it to real-world situations.